I'm Daniel, 28, and I've spent most of my life being underestimated by my family. Not in a subtle, teasing way. No, this was full on. You'll never amount to anything kind of dismissal. From the time I graduated high school to the first time I tried to start my own business, my brother, my parents, and even some distant relatives made it painfully clear that my ambitions were a joke. My brother, Marcus, especially loved to remind me of how responsible and successful he was, even when his version of success was mostly inherited money and connections my parents had set him up with. I, on the other hand, had nothing but my ideas, my work ethic, and a stubborn streak that refused to let their insults define me. It all started that day, at a gala my parents insisted we attend. I had just turned 28, and despite everything, I'd managed to scrape together a modest fortune from a startup I'd poured every ounce of energy into. Nothing flashy, no Lamborghini in the driveway, no sprawling mansion, but enough that I could finally walk into a room without feeling like I was drowning in the shadow of Marcus or my father's high expectations. My father, of course, didn't see it that way. He had spent the drive lecturing me about how practical choices were the only ones that mattered, how I should have a more stable job, and why risking everything on my business was a mistake. Marcus, as usual, treated me like I was a character in a comedy meant solely for his amusement. He had his usual smirk plastered across his face as we walked into the ballroom, all polished and smug in his tailored suit. "You really think that little app of yours is going to get you anywhere, Danny?" he sneered, nudging me with his elbow. "You'll never make something of yourself. I mean, really, why even bother trying?" For a moment, I wanted to say something cutting, something that would shut him up, but I didn't. I just smiled, the kind of smile that hid a storm behind it, and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that showing them they got under my skin only fed their sense of superiority. So I let him talk, let him think his words had weight, while I focused on something else entirely, the fact that this gala wasn't just any event. It was a networking opportunity, a chance to rub elbows with investors, CEOs, and people who could actually make things happen. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged in that room, even if my family didn't see it yet. As we were escorted to the main hall, Marcus kept up his running commentary, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I can't believe you're still wearing that, Danny. Seriously, is that the best you can do?" My father gave me a look that was part disapproval, part disappointment, as if my wardrobe somehow reflected my entire worth. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself that tonight wasn't about them. Tonight, it was about me proving, silently, that their approval was irrelevant. Then came the moment that made my chest tighten in a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The event coordinator, a tall woman in a sleek black dress, approached me directly as Marcus was mid-sentence about my supposed failures. Her voice was calm, but her eyes had a spark of recognition. "Congratulations, Mr. Hale. Your VIP table awaits." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. My brother froze mid-sentence, his smirk faltering. My father's face turned pale, a strange mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Marcus opened his mouth, probably to make another sarcastic remark, but nothing came out. For once, he was speechless. And in that moment, I realized that nothing in this room, or in the world I'd built for myself, would ever be the same. I followed the coordinator, every step deliberate, feeling a mixture of triumph and disbelief. The VIP section was more extravagant than I had expected, complete with plush seating, private waitstaff, and a view that overlooked the entire event floor. I could hear my family somewhere behind me, their voices muted but the tension in them unmistakable. The fact that I'd been recognized, acknowledged, and valued in a space they thought they controlled ignited something in me, a slow-burning determination that this was only the beginning. As I settled into my chair, I couldn't help but glance back at them. Marcus's face was contorted with disbelief. My father looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, and my mother, well, she was the only one who masked her reaction with a polite, forced smile, though her eyes betrayed the same shock. For the first time, I felt a shift, not just tonight, but in the dynamics that had ruled my entire life. And I knew, deep down, that they had no idea what was coming. The night dragged on, filled with clinking glasses, laughter, and the hum of conversation that only seemed to underscore my family's discomfort. Every time I caught Marcus's eyes, I could see the storm of resentment brewing, the kind that was only fueled by envy and pride. My father hovered nearby, trying to reclaim some sense of control, offering forced congratulations that felt like insults in disguise. And through it all, I sat back, calm, letting them stew in their assumptions while silently plotting my next move. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about showing them, definitively, that their words, their mockery, and their dismissive attitudes couldn't touch the person I had become. I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted them to witness it, to feel the full weight of underestimating me. And the more I watched them squirm in their social discomfort, the more I realized that tonight was just the start of a long, calculated shift in power. Every laugh, every polite nod from someone important, every whisper of recognition in the room felt like fuel. I could see Marcus tightening his jaw, muttering something under his breath, probably about how he'd always been better. But I wasn't angry, at least not in the way they expected. I was focused, patient, and for the first time, I understood that revenge didn't need to be loud or overt. Sometimes it was subtle, surgical, and infinitely more satisfying when it unfolded with precision. As the night went on, I sipped my drink, observing my family from a distance. I noticed the way Marcus tried to angle for attention, the way my father's smile never quite reached his eyes, and the way my mother kept glancing between us, caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. I could feel the tension crackling, a silent acknowledgement that the tables had turned, and I was the one in control. The first seed of my plan had been planted. I knew I couldn't rush it, couldn't let my emotions dictate the pace. This wasn't a one-night victory. It was a series of moves, carefully calculated, designed to unravel the arrogance and entitlement that had defined my family for decades. And as I looked back at them one last time before the coordinator led me to my private table, I felt a thrill I hadn't known in years, the sweet, intoxicating knowledge that for once, I was the one they couldn't touch, the one they couldn't predict, and the one who was quietly, steadily rewriting the story of my life. The next few weeks after that gala were surreal. On one hand, I felt unstoppable, like a man finally shedding the skin of doubt and ridicule my family had forced onto me for years. On the other, every interaction with my family seemed to grow more strained, more toxic, as if they sensed the shift in power but couldn't figure out how to counter it. Marcus, in particular, became unbearable. He had always had a talent for making my life miserable, but now it felt like he was doubling down with a sense of desperation. It started small, backhanded comments at family dinners, subtle digs at my accomplishments. "So, your little startup finally turned a profit?" he'd ask, his tone dripping with condescension. "I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day." My parents, who had once nodded along and even reinforced these comments, now seemed uncertain. My father's disapproval lingered in the air, like a shadow that was both familiar and frustratingly distant. My mother oscillated between polite smiles and quiet whispers of, "Daniel, maybe you should be more careful with your spending." But none of their words carried the same weight anymore, and I could feel it. I tried to keep my interactions civil, even cordial, but the tension was unavoidable. Every phone call home felt like walking a minefield. Every visit to their house was a delicate balance between staying calm and asserting my boundaries. I began to notice the favoritism in ways I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had just been too naive to acknowledge it. Marcus was always given the first choice of anything, the biggest slice of pie, the comfiest chair, the attention of my parents. Meanwhile, I was relegated to leftovers in every sense of the word, a secondary presence whose success was either minimized or twisted into a cautionary tale. Then came the day that changed everything. I had been invited to another high-profile networking event, one that was crucial for the next stage of my business. I was nervous, sure, but also confident. I had learned from my previous experiences that my family's opinions, though sharp, didn't define me. I prepared, polished, and made sure every detail was perfect. I even mentioned it casually during dinner the night before, hoping to gauge my family's reaction. Networking event. Marcus scoffed, flicking his hair back in that way he did when he thought he was clever. "You mean one of those get-rich-quick parties? Don't tell me you're planning to embarrass yourself again." My father, sighing, added, "Daniel, you should focus on real work, not these frivolous social gatherings." I didn't respond. I'd learned that arguing was pointless. Words meant nothing when my achievements spoke louder than their insults ever could. But the seed of tension was planted. The next evening, I dressed carefully in a tailored suit, a subtle but undeniable upgrade from what I normally wore when visiting them. My portfolio was organized, my pitch rehearsed, and my confidence high. I told them I'd be back late and that I appreciated their support, which earned me the usual skeptical looks. I left without a word, determined not to let their negativity linger. At the event, everything seemed to click. I moved through the crowd with ease, conversed with investors and entrepreneurs, and even got invited to sit at a private roundtable that included some of the most influential figures in my industry. The coordinator who had recognized me at the previous gala smiled knowingly, and I felt that same thrill of quiet vindication. I wasn't just attending, I was being acknowledged, validated, and, most importantly, positioned. Meanwhile, I had no idea that back at my parents' house, Marcus had begun scheming. He called my father mid-evening, speaking in hushed tones that I would later learn were laced with exaggeration and outright lies. He painted a picture of me as reckless, irresponsible, and unworthy of the attention I had received. By the time I returned home, I could sense the shift in energy immediately. The moment I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. My mother was seated stiffly in the living room, her hands folded over her lap, eyes darting toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to appear at any second. My father stood nearby, his posture rigid, jaw tight. And Marcus, he was leaning casually against the doorway, a smirk that didn't reach his eyes plastered across his face. "Daniel," my father said, voice strained. "We need to talk." I frowned, setting my bag down carefully. "About what?" Marcus stepped forward, all charm and feigned concern. "Dad thought you should know about some things that happened while you were out tonight." My heart sank. I had learned to recognize this pattern. Marcus would plant doubt, manipulate the narrative, and watch my parents take the bait. But even then, nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "Daniel," my mother began, her voice unusually quiet. We found out that your startup has been, well, it's not exactly as you've told us." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight but controlled. Marcus leaned in, eyes sparkling with triumph. "Turns out, your investors are pulling out, Danny. Heard some rumors about mismanagement. You might want to be careful before you ruin your reputation further." I froze, my stomach dropping. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Had something really gone wrong? Or was this another of Marcus's schemes? Before I could respond, my father interrupted, voice shaking. "Daniel, we need to consider what this means. Maybe you should step back, rethink your plans. You've been so reckless." I could feel the familiar mix of anger and hurt building inside me. I had poured years into this business, sacrificed nights, weekends, and every ounce of energy I had. And here they were, once again, dismissing my work, buying into my brother's lies without even checking the facts. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. I took a step back, breathing slowly, trying to calm the storm inside me. "Wait," I said, voice steady. "Are you saying you believe him?" "Without any proof." Marcus smirked, as if my disbelief was proof of my naivete. "Come on, Danny. Even you have to admit things aren't exactly smooth sailing. Dad just wants to help you avoid a bigger mistake." I shook my head, fury simmering beneath the surface. "Help me? By siding with the person who's been undermining me my entire life?" My mother's expression faltered, and I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it was fleeting. My father looked torn between his instinct to protect his eldest son and the nagging voice of reason he refused to acknowledge. The moment crystallized something inside me. This wasn't just about financial success, or recognition, or even proving Marcus wrong. This was about trust, about respect, about reclaiming control over my own life. And if my family was unwilling or incapable of seeing my value, then I would have to show them in a way they couldn't ignore. By the time I went to my room that night, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a quiet, relentless determination. I replayed every conversation, every insult, every subtle betrayal I had endured. The pattern was clear. Marcus's jealousy, my parents' favoritism, the constant undermining. It had all led to this moment. And for the first time, I realized something crucial. I didn't need them to believe in me. I only needed to be smart, patient, and unrelenting. I spent the rest of the night drafting plans in my mind, considering every avenue of influence I could leverage. If they thought tonight's betrayal would stop me, they had no idea what was coming. But I also knew I had to be careful. This wasn't about a fit of anger or impulsive revenge. It had to be precise, strategic, and undeniable. One wrong move, and I could lose not just my dignity, but the respect I'd fought so hard to earn. As I drifted to sleep, I felt the first sparks of a plan forming. And somewhere deep inside, I understood that the next time my family tried to belittle me, to manipulate the truth, or to undermine my efforts, they wouldn't just be disappointed. They would see the full measure of what it meant to underestimate me. Little did I know, though, that the betrayal Marcus orchestrated was just the beginning. And the real reckoning, the kind that would make every insult, every sneer, every dismissive glance pale in comparison, was closer than I could have imagined. The days that followed Marcus's betrayal were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. At first, I was numb. Every step felt heavy. Every conversation with my family a reminder of how thoroughly they'd underestimated me. Even my father, the man who had once been my anchor, seemed to crumble under the weight of my brother's manipulation. The subtle disbelief in his eyes when I tried to defend myself stung far more than any direct insult from Marcus ever could. My mother, ever cautious and prim, hovered in a way that felt more like a leash than support. I could feel their judgment pressing in on me from every angle, and the isolation was suffocating. I spent nights pacing my apartment, staring at the skyline through the living room window, replaying the gala, the phone calls, the words that had cut deeper than anything I'd ever heard. The idea that my life's work could be so easily twisted, dismissed, and devalued by my own family was unbearable. Part of me wanted to lash out, to confront them, to scream until the echoes of my anger shook the walls. But another, calmer part of me understood something essential. If I reacted in rage, I would be handing them exactly what they wanted, a sense of control. And I had spent too long letting them define me to fall into that trap. So I retreated. I retreated from them, from their toxic judgments, and from the social obligations that had once seemed unavoidable. I focused instead on the one thing no one could touch, my vision. Every ounce of energy I had went into my work, not for their validation, not for applause, but for myself. I began reevaluating my strategy, analyzing every misstep, every vulnerability that Marcus and my family could exploit, and planning around it. It was painstaking, slow, and often lonely work, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt a sense of control that didn't rely on their approval. I remember the exact moment things began to shift. I was sitting in a small, dimly lit coffee shop, laptop open in front of me, reviewing projections that were far from perfect, but promising nonetheless. I had been poring over spreadsheets, market analyses, and potential partnerships for hours, and exhaustion was threatening to overwhelm me. And then my phone buzzed. It was an email from a potential investor I had met at one of the galas, the one who had quietly observed me the night Marcus and my parents had tried to undermine me. The subject line read, "Following up on your pitch, let's schedule a meeting." I stared at it for a long moment, disbelief and hope warring inside me. Then, almost instinctively, I smiled, the kind of smile that hid a deep resolve. This was a crack in the storm my family had created. I didn't need to prove anything to Marcus or my parents anymore. The world was beginning to notice me in ways they couldn't ignore. The next few weeks became a blur of preparation and cautious optimism. I refined my pitch, anticipated every question, and polished every presentation. I didn't tell anyone, certainly not my family. I didn't need to. Letting them see my progress too soon would have given them time to interfere, to belittle, to twist the narrative before I could set it straight. This was a private campaign, my own quiet revolution. Meanwhile, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He could sense, even if he couldn't articulate it, that I was no longer the same person who tolerated his jabs. He tried his usual tactics, mockery, subtle manipulation, even attempts to sabotage me through mutual acquaintances, but I was prepared this time. I kept meticulous records, double-checked facts, and maintained a calm, almost impenetrable exterior. Each attempt he made to undermine me only fueled my determination. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was adapting, evolving, and growing stronger. I started seeing results sooner than I expected. The first investor meeting went better than I could have imagined. They were impressed not only by my product, but by my clarity of vision and composure under pressure. The second meeting followed the same pattern, and soon, small offers began to trickle in, partnerships forming quietly behind the scenes. My confidence grew with each success, but I kept it hidden, like a fire smoldering beneath ash, waiting for the right moment to roar. The more I achieved, the more I realized something fundamental. Success wasn't just about money, prestige, or recognition. It was about reclaiming myself. Every early morning, every sleepless night, every calculated decision I made was a brick in the foundation of a person I was finally proud to be. And the irony was delicious. Marcus, who had once ridiculed every step I took, now existed in a world where he could no longer predict or control me. But even as I rebuilt my life and my confidence, the ache of betrayal lingered. I had trusted my family, believed in their guidance, and expected at least some acknowledgement of my effort. Instead, I had been blindsided, forced to confront not only their favoritism but the fact that they were actively working against me. It was a bitter pill, but it crystallized my understanding. If I wanted justice, not petty revenge, but real, undeniable vindication, I would have to orchestrate it carefully. Every move had to be deliberate, every victory calculated. Patience, I realized, was my greatest weapon. I began thinking strategically, mapping out a path that didn't just include rebuilding my business, but creating a scenario where my family's behavior would be exposed and powerless in the face of my success. I identified allies in ways I hadn't before, building relationships with people who appreciated talent, vision, and integrity, not social status or familial connections. Slowly, methodically, I surrounded myself with people who believed in me, whose support was genuine and whose influence could amplify the impact of my eventual return. And yet, despite all the forward motion, the old wounds remained. Every time I thought about Marcus, I felt a simmering mix of anger and disbelief. Every glance at my parents reminded me that love, in their world, came with conditions, with a hierarchy that favored entitlement and charisma over hard work and integrity. I realized that my fight wasn't just for validation. It was for self-worth, for dignity, and for the right to define my life on my own terms. One evening, as I closed my laptop after a long day of planning and correspondence, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I thought about that gala, the email that sparked a turnaround, and the weeks of quiet, almost invisible progress I had made. I realized that I had crossed an invisible line. The line between being the person my family underestimated and being the person they would someday regret underestimating. The difference was subtle but powerful. I no longer measured my value by their approval. I measured it by my own actions, my own accomplishments, and the integrity with which I built them. That night, I made a promise to myself. No matter what Marcus tried next, no matter how my parents attempted to reassert their influence, I would remain focused, patient, and strategic. I wasn't just rebuilding a business. I was rebuilding my life, my confidence, and my sense of justice. And when the time came, I would not just show them, they would feel it. Because in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets, notes, and plans, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. For the first time, my family no longer held the strings. I did. And that knowledge, more than any investor, any deal, or any gala, was intoxicating. The rise, I realized, would be quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it would be relentless. And when it reached its peak, my family, Marcus above all, would understand, in a way they could not ignore, the cost of underestimating me. Little did I know that the next phase of this journey would demand more than patience and planning. It would require exposing truths they had long buried, secrets they thought were safe, and weaknesses they believed invincible. And in that coming storm, everything would change, forever. By the time I entered the 4th month since Marcus's latest betrayal, my life had changed in ways that were subtle to the untrained eye, but seismic to me. Every day, I was building quietly, almost invisibly, a life that was wholly my own. My startup was no longer a fragile experiment. It was gaining traction, reputation, and real investors who saw the value in what I had created. Unlike before, every meeting, every handshake, and every contract was carefully documented, every move meticulously planned. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. The more I succeeded, the more I realized just how much my family had underestimated me. Marcus, of course, continued to act like the self-appointed crown prince of our household. He flaunted temporary successes, flashy dinners, borrowed designer suits, and half-baked business schemes that fell apart the moment anyone examined them too closely. My parents, bless their obliviousness, praised him for small accomplishments as if they defined his worth, while still trying to dismiss mine. They didn't know it, but I had been quietly recording their words, actions, and manipulations for months. Every slight, every underhanded comment, every attempt to gaslight me had been logged, cataloged, and stored for later. I began to assemble a network of allies, though not in the dramatic, visible way Marcus had always imagined. These were people who valued talent, vision, and integrity, investors, business mentors, and even former competitors who respected my work. I didn't announce it, I didn't broadcast it. I just quietly nurtured these relationships, strengthening connections that would later amplify the impact of my eventual rise. In the meantime, I kept my personal victories modest in my family's eyes. Let them think I was struggling, that I was still the rejected son or a failed brother. It was a delicate dance, deception for the sake of strategy. Marcus, predictably, became more erratic. He noticed a shift in how people responded to me at events, how contacts who had once politely dismissed me now sought my attention, and how whispers of my progress had begun circulating. He tried to keep up appearances, boasting to my parents and friends about deals that didn't exist, name-dropping connections that were purely imaginary. The desperation in his eyes whenever he thought I wasn't watching was deliciously satisfying, though I kept my own excitement carefully muted. Patience, I reminded myself, was my greatest weapon. One afternoon, I received a message from a former mentor who had left the corporate world for consulting. He had heard about my startup through the grapevine, and he wanted to meet. This was a pivotal opportunity, not just to gain insight, but to leverage his influence and credibility. We met at a quiet cafe, the kind of place where business deals could be discussed without prying eyes. Over coffee, he asked me about my strategy, my vision, and my long-term goals. I spoke candidly, carefully planting seeds that would later serve to expand my reach and credibility. By the time we left, he was visibly impressed and agreed to make introductions to a handful of high-profile investors who could change everything. I didn't tell my family. Not a word. Let them continue thinking I was struggling. They were already proving themselves incapable of recognizing real talent anyway. Instead, I moved deliberately, each small victory compounding into a larger plan. Every meeting, every signed contract, every investor impressed became a step closer to the point when they would no longer be able to ignore me. Meanwhile, at home, Marcus was steadily unraveling. He became more audacious in his attempts to belittle me, trying to provoke a reaction that would allow him to reclaim his sense of superiority. One evening, over a supposed family dinner, he leaned across the table and said, "You know, Danny, maybe you should consider that some things aren't meant for people like you. Some doors just aren't for everyone." My father, predictably, nodded along, his eyes reflecting a mixture of skepticism and the faintest trace of approval for Marcus's cruelty. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sipped my water slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Inside, a plan was taking shape. I had been documenting his lies, his manipulations, his petty triumphs, and my parents' complicity. Everything was being cataloged in a way that would make their arrogance and favoritism impossible to dismiss. And the best part? They had no idea. I also started leveraging my growing influence in subtle ways. Invitations to private events, exclusive dinners, and networking sessions began to arrive with increasing frequency. Every time I attended, I carefully curated my presence. No flashy displays of wealth, no over-the-top gestures, just quiet confidence and competence. People noticed, people respected, and people began associating me with success, credibility, and authority. Marcus, of course, saw some of this but failed to understand its significance. To him, it was all luck, timing, or chance. He didn't realize that every step I had taken was calculated, strategic, and deliberate. Then came a turning point. A minor, seemingly innocuous family gathering that would later reveal itself as a critical moment. My parents had invited a few relatives over for a Sunday lunch, and Marcus saw it as the perfect stage for his usual performance. He made pointed remarks about my supposed failures, poked fun at my modest apartment, and insinuated that my business ventures were foolish. He didn't realize, of course, that I had arranged for one of my most influential investors to be in town, someone whose opinion could silently shift the balance of power. As we sat at the table, Marcus boasting and my parents nodding along, I excused myself briefly. I returned with a casual air, introducing my investor friend as someone I'd met recently who had been instrumental in advising my startup. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. He didn't know who this person was, nor did he grasp the implications. My parents, always eager to impress guests but utterly unaware of the stakes, welcomed him politely, unknowingly providing the perfect contrast, my growing competence against Marcus's hollow bravado. Over the course of lunch, my investor friend asked questions about my work, and I answered with precision, confidence, and subtle authority. Each response, each insight, was a quiet demonstration of capability that Marcus could neither mimic nor undermine. By the time dessert arrived, I could see the shift in the room. Marcus's smirk had faded, replaced by a twitching frustration. My father's forced smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And my mother, well, she finally began to see that my achievements weren't as insignificant as she had believed. This was the moment I realized that the slow burn of my revenge had begun. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't public yet. But the seeds had been planted. The groundwork was laid. And when the time came to act, when I would finally reveal the full extent of what I had built, it would be undeniable. I spent the following weeks consolidating my position. I scheduled meetings, secured partnerships, and refined every aspect of my public and professional persona. All the while, Marcus continued to act like the dominant figure in the family, unaware that his arrogance and assumptions were being quietly dismantled. My parents, ever slow to perceive reality, remained blissfully ignorant. Their favoritism still skewed toward the son who had squandered opportunities and underestimated me at every turn. The thrill of knowing that my family's assumptions were about to backfire completely was intoxicating. I began to sketch out the final moves, the moments where their ignorance and arrogance would be confronted with undeniable evidence of my competence and success. I knew the timing had to be perfect. The reveal had to hit them all at once, leaving no room for denial, no way to twist the narrative in their favor. Patience had brought me this far, and precision would carry me the rest of the way. Yet, even with all the planning and preparation, a small part of me acknowledged the lingering risk. Marcus was unpredictable, my parents were stubborn, and life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. But the stakes had never been higher, and the potential reward, vindication, respect, and the sweet satisfaction of proving every skeptic wrong, was too significant to ignore. As I reviewed my notes late one night, cross-referencing investor contacts, potential public appearances, and subtle ways to highlight Marcus's failures without overtly confronting him, I felt a surge of exhilaration. Every detail mattered. Every misstep he had ever made, every insult he had ever thrown, every moment of favoritism my parents had exhibited, it would all serve as fuel for the ultimate reveal. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a rare smile. I wasn't just planning revenge. I was crafting justice. And when the day finally came, it wouldn't just be a simple confrontation. It would be a complete overturning of the hierarchy that had dominated my life for so long. A meticulous demonstration that underestimating me had been the gravest mistake my family had ever made. I could feel the tension in my chest, the kind that comes from knowing you are on the brink of something monumental. Everything was in place. Every ally was aligned. Every moment of manipulation and dismissal I had endured would contribute to the eventual reckoning. And as I finally closed my laptop, exhausted but exhilarated, I knew one thing for certain. The next phase, the phase where my rise became impossible to ignore, was coming, and nothing would stop it. The night had arrived. Months of meticulous planning, quiet maneuvering, and careful cultivation of allies had led to this single moment, and I could feel the tension in my chest, steady and deliberate, like the beat of a drum announcing the start of a performance. I wasn't rushing, and I wasn't nervous, the kind of nerves that come from doubt or insecurity, but a focused energy that sharpened every thought, every move. I had waited for this, crafted every detail, and now, finally, it was time to act. The venue was an exclusive gala, one that had initially seemed just another networking opportunity, but had become the perfect stage for what I intended. Marcus had, of course, been invited through our parents, who still operated on the assumption that appearances and inherited privilege carried more weight than actual achievement. They didn't know that the night would expose the fragility of everything they had relied on to assert dominance over me. They didn't know that the narrative they had spent decades crafting, of Marcus as the successful, enviable son and me as the underachiever, was about to be shattered. I arrived early, taking my time to walk through the space, observing the layout, noting exits, entrances, and the arrangement of tables. My allies, investors, business mentors, and influential figures who had quietly aligned with me over the past months were in place, discreetly positioned so that their presence would amplify the effect when the moment came. Every camera, every journalist, every socialite who mattered was here. They didn't yet know it, but they were about to witness a demonstration of skill, composure, and authority that would leave no room for denial. My family arrived later, as expected. Marcus, predictably, strutted in with an air of superiority, unaware that the room had already begun to shift under my quiet influence. My parents followed, my father offering the usual strained smile, my mother carefully maintaining her composure. They saw only a man walking in late, as if nothing significant had changed, and I allowed them to think it was just another ordinary evening. That miscalculation, of course, was their undoing. As the gala progressed, I observed them from a distance, noting their interactions, their small gestures of superiority, and the way Marcus attempted to engage with others, fishing for compliments, seeking validation, all while oblivious to the subtle undercurrent that I had created. My allies, quietly seated in strategic locations, watched as well, waiting for the precise moment when their presence would give weight to the reveal I had orchestrated. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Marcus, ever eager to assert himself, had boasted loudly to a group of attendees about his business acumen and networking prowess, framing himself as the family's shining example. The group, influential figures in the industry, were polite but skeptical, and I could see their curiosity growing as he exaggerated and floundered. I approached casually, offering introductions and insight, letting the moment build naturally. When I finally spoke, it was calm, measured, and authoritative. My words weren't just persuasive, they were definitive. Each statement subtly highlighted my accomplishments, my strategic vision, and the undeniable results of my work. The contrast was stark, and it didn't go unnoticed. Marcus's smirk faltered. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's polite expression faltered, betraying a flicker of realization. And the room, already composed of influential observers, began to shift. Whispers started to circulate, attention turning naturally toward me as people recognized the depth of my knowledge, the clarity of my vision, and the impact of my work. I didn't need to boast. I didn't need to shout. The evidence was there, undeniable, and it spoke louder than any argument I could have made. Then came the private demonstration. My startup had recently developed a tool with substantial industry impact, one that had quietly gone under the radar of mainstream media, but was recognized among insiders as revolutionary. I arranged for a live demonstration, a subtle but undeniable showcase of the product's capabilities. Marcus, oblivious, had bragged to everyone in attendance about his latest venture, expecting admiration. Instead, the demonstration, live, clear, and irrefutable, highlighted my achievements while simultaneously underscoring the lack of substance in his boasts. The contrast was devastating. By the time the demonstration concluded, Marcus was pale, stammering, and visibly flustered. My father, his composure shaken, attempted to intervene, trying to defend Marcus's reputation, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. My work, my success, my strategic foresight, and my calm authority stood in stark contrast to Marcus's hollow gestures, empty claims, and obvious insecurities. The room, previously a stage for family appearances, had become a courtroom, and the verdict was undeniable. I watched, composed but internally satisfied, as my family struggled to maintain face. Marcus's attempts at deflection were clumsy, awkward, and only drew further attention to his failings. My father, always eager to project control, looked increasingly lost, grasping at illusions of authority that had long since slipped through his fingers. My mother, caught between pride and disbelief, could do little more than sit quietly, her carefully maintained facade cracking in the subtle but unmistakable realization that their assumptions about me had been catastrophically wrong. The whispers and glances among the attendees were unmistakable. People were discussing my achievements, my strategic mind, and the undeniable proof of my competence. Invitations for future collaboration were extended on the spot. Contacts I had cultivated over months of careful planning approached with offers I had only dreamed of. And through it all, my family realized they had been spectators to a transformation they hadn't anticipated and couldn't undo. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The power of the moment was in its quiet inevitability. The record of my preparation, the strength of my work, and the clarity of my execution spoke for themselves. I had not only succeeded in building a life that my family could no longer dismiss, but I had done so on my own terms, with precision, intelligence, and patience. Every slight, every insult, every bit of favoritism that had been leveled against me now fed the satisfaction of this triumph. Later, after the gala concluded, my family followed me out, still attempting to salvage some sense of dignity. Marcus's usual arrogance had been replaced by frustration and disbelief. My father tried, subtly, to engage me in private, his words stumbling, half-formed. My mother attempted to speak, but her voice carried the weight of belated realization rather than support. I listened, calmly, letting their attempts at reconciliation hang in the air. There was nothing to reconcile. I had already won, not just in their eyes, but in the larger world that mattered. In the quiet aftermath, as I walked to my car with my allies, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The months of careful planning, patient rebuilding, and strategic networking had culminated in an undeniable victory. The satisfaction was not just in their shock or their embarrassment, but in the knowledge that I had achieved it without sacrificing my integrity, my composure, or my focus. I hadn't stooped to manipulation or petty vindictiveness. I had let the truth of my competence and determination speak for itself. Marcus would no longer have the power to belittle me, to undermine my efforts, or to shape the narrative of my life. My father would no longer view me through the lens of disappointment or doubt. And my mother would finally have to recognize that her favoritism had been misplaced, that her understanding of value, success, and merit had been profoundly flawed. As I drove home that night, the city lights stretching out before me, I realized something profound. Revenge, in its most satisfying form, doesn't always need to be loud, dramatic, or vengeful in the conventional sense. Sometimes, it is quiet, calculated, and undeniable. It is built through excellence, persistence, and unassailable competence. And in that quiet, meticulous execution, the impact is far more enduring than any shouted insult or impulsive confrontation could ever achieve. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew the final chapter had been written. My family's arrogance and underestimation had been dismantled not by anger, not by confrontation, but by the unassailable power of my success. Marcus would spend years recalibrating, attempting to reclaim some sense of superiority that had been irrevocably stripped away. My parents would carry the weight of belated realization and the knowledge that their judgment had failed them. And I, at last, could breathe freely, unburdened by the chains of expectation, ridicule, and favoritism that had plagued my life for so long. As I closed the door behind me, the silence of my apartment felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to smile fully, without restraint, without doubt. I had not only survived, I had risen. I had not only reclaimed my dignity, I had redefined it. And in that quiet, powerful moment, I understood something vital. The story of my life was mine alone to write, and I had written it with precision, strength, and unshakable resolve. The past, with all its mockery, favoritism, and betrayal, was no longer a shackle. It was merely the prelude to the triumph I had achieved on my own terms. And as I sank into the comfort of my chair, finally allowing myself to relax, I realized, with perfect clarity, that nothing, and no one, would ever be able to underestimate me again.